This message is brought to you by DoNotAge.org, the longevity research organisation that's on a mission to extend health span for as many people as possible via products that actually work. Start your journey today at DoNotAge.org and use code LLAMA for a 10% discount. That's LLAMA.
I'm a big believer in this is it. This is our life. And we have to make it count, and what makes us happy in our everyday life and in the longer term is really important.
Hello again and welcome to the Live Long and Master Aging podcast. This is where we explore the science and stories behind human longevity.
This episode is brought to you in association with Juvicell, the all-in-one longevity supplement that contains 10 key ingredients shown to have a positive impact on health span, as validated by scientific studies. To find out more, visit Juvicell.com. That's Juvicell.com.
Today we're going to dive into some of the science and research, as it happens, research going on here in Los Angeles, into the biological mechanisms of aging, which the better we understand, the more likely we are able to develop interventions and preventative strategies to mitigate the downsides of getting old, the cognitive and physical decline that comes with aging. My guest is Dr. David Walker, Professor in the Department of Integrative Biology and Physiology at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Walker, welcome to the Live Long and Master Aging podcast.
Great to be here and wonderful to meet you, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Me too. We are, as I mentioned, in the same city. We're doing this remotely, which is a little bit frustrating. It's necessary because of the times that we're going through. How has the pandemic, the past year, how has it affected you and your work?
Of course, there have been a lot of challenges. The lab was shut down from mid-March until June. And then we slowly ramped up, and we're making progress, but it's been lots of challenges. But I start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I start to regain some optimism, and I think things are starting to go finally in the right direction, and hopefully we can put a lot of this behind us.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So let's talk about your background initially. And actually, before we delve into that, just for full disclosure, this podcast, as we've just mentioned, is supported by Juvicell. You're a part of the scientific advisory board for Juvicell, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. That's relatively recent happening. It's something that's just happened within the last few months, but something I'm excited to be involved in.
Okay, so let's talk about your work. And I know you've been on quite a journey in terms of your education, and at least one place that you've studied in leapt out at me, Manchester in northwest England, which is a city that I know quite well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so even before, I'll give the short but full history. I grew up in Belfast in the north of Ireland in the 80s really, and did my undergrad degree at Queen's University Belfast. Undergrad degree in genetics, and really just became fascinated by genetics and how we can both better understand mechanisms of disease and even behavior and many different things. And then after completing that degree, I was interested to A, study for a PhD, and B, get out of Northern Ireland at that time. And I was and remain a big fan of Manchester United, and that was not, that was part of it wasn't the only reason, but I looked around and got accepted in a few programs, mainly in Scotland and England, and Manchester United. The Manchester music scene was really, really buzzing at that time. And also, Manchester has, a couple of great universities, and it's a great, great university town. It's a fairly diverse, English city, probably second only to London, right? I did a master's degree and also my PhD there.
So then you eventually moved to California.
Yep. So maybe 4 or 5 years of, grey skies and rain, and, Manchester United had just won the treble, so I don't know what was left to do after that. So
and the weather gets to everyone eventually.
Eventually. I was always going to do a postdoc, and it coincided. I read a book called Time, Love and Memory, which it wasn't an autobiography, but it was a biography of Seymour Benzer, who was, really one of the giants of, biology of the last, 60, 70 years. And he had just started getting interested in aging research. So my own PhD work was also on aging, and I studied aging in a tiny microscopic nematode worm, which is a great genetic model to this day. And Seymour Benzer had started getting interested in studying aging in a different invertebrate model, the fruit fly Drosophila. And like I say, I recently read, just out of interest, I didn't think it would have anything to impact my career in any way, but a great biography of Benzer, Time, Love and Memory. And he was based at Caltech, which is in Pasadena, is still technically in the same city that we're both in today. And, of course, I'd heard of, Stanford and MIT and Harvard, and all these other great American universities. But actually, for whatever reason, Caltech, I knew of Richard Feynman, of course. But for whatever reason, I wasn't quite as familiar. I had to look it up where exactly it was on the map. But I wrote to Seymour, and and the rest is history, I guess. So I ended up going out to do my postdoc, in the early 2000s in Caltech.
And you mentioned nematode worms and fruit flies, Drosophila. They have the same attraction in large part because of their short lifespan.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm perhaps somewhat biased because those are the two model organisms I've focused on in my career, but the vast majority of our understanding of the basic biological mechanisms of aging have come primarily through discoveries in those two model organisms. Of course, a lot of that work has been built upon and validated in rodent models and other mammalian models, but the initial discoveries of which genes, which pathways, initially came almost entirely out of research in those two invertebrate genetic models.
So after initially studying genetics, you became increasingly interested and fascinated by the aging process. Has your understanding of what aging is, and say a definition of aging, has that evolved over the time that you've been studying it?
Yes, for sure. So I started thinking about aging in the mid-1990s, so 25 years ago. And it would be stated now, as many of us still do today, that aging is a great scientific mystery. There's a lot of mysteries to aging today, but back then that was not hyperbole. That was, we really didn't know almost anything about what was aging at a cellular level, which changes that occur actually drive age-related health decline. And really, it's been in the last, I would argue, 10 years that our understanding of what really is driving aging at a cellular level has really increased. Now, people still argue. There are those that still argue that aging may not be a damage accumulation hypothesis. I think the evidence is pretty good that the accumulation of damage to cellular components, proteins, lipids, organelles, does drive the aging process. Some people would still argue against that, but I think it's pretty compelling at this stage.
And is it fair then to say that the focus of your work is on looking for potential interventions that could mitigate the effects of that damage and as I mentioned it earlier, the negative effects of getting old, the physical decline and the mental decline as well?
Yes, absolutely. And speaking of, sort of evolutions in my own career and in my own way of thinking about this, when I was studying for a PhD, or even a little later, when I was in my 20s, I really did think of it as a purely academic problem, a purely curiosity-driven program, because perhaps at that stage of your life, you're not quite as focused upon age-related health decline, and it's not so much as if the strategies change, because to understand aging at a cellular level, I would still argue you do have to intervene. There's a limit to how much we can really learn by simply measuring what changes with age. You're always going to come up against the problem of whatever you see change, how do you know that's not a correlate of aging or a consequence of aging? When you intervene using genetics or small compounds or diet or whatever, then that gives confidence that whatever you're studying, whatever molecule, gene, pathway that you're manipulating is causally or mechanistically involved in the aging process. So yes, absolutely. A major focus of our work to this day is not only to understand what changes take place with age, but to try and develop novel ways, primarily using genes, but we can discuss other approaches we're more recently taking, but to prevent those changes from taking place and prevent age-related health decline.
And just a little aside, you mentioned that perhaps when we are younger, we don't really think about aging as much, or perhaps even at all, because there is perhaps that sense that we are, so far away from being very old that it's something we don't need to concern ourselves with. And one thing I always try to get across to people who are significantly younger is that perhaps we would all be better off if we did start thinking about aging much, much earlier in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, we of course, we're familiar with it through, our parents and certainly our grandparents. So it's not something we're oblivious to, but I think there's very much, when you're young, there's sort of an inevitability about it, or sort of normalness about it, that I think, now some of us are starting to challenge this concept of it. Does it, really have to, do we have to, lose, as you say, our physical or mental capacities so dramatically with chronological age?
So let's dive in a little deeper into the work that you're doing in terms of cells and cell health. What is the main focus? And we'll continue this conversation in just a moment.
Hey, quick question for you. Are you someone who wants to be fit, healthy, and happy? And what if I told you could get your dream body by simply just listening to a podcast? I'm Josh.
And I'm KG, and we're the hosts of the Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast.
Listen, we get it. Fitness isn't easy. Carbs, no carbs.
Just stop, okay? It doesn't have to be that complicated. And that's why we made this podcast. We get straight to the facts so you can become your best you.
So the way to check us out is click the link in the show notes or search Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast on any of the major podcast platforms. We'll see you soon.
Yeah, so for the most part, I've sort of taken an approach over my career, which is to let the data drive the hypothesis. So some people may say, I'm going to say telomeres are important for aging, or free radicals are important for aging, and then go after, genes or compounds that alter. We've been fairly broad and open-minded as which genes and approaches, and we've even earlier in my career done unbiased genetic screens. But in the last 5 or 6 years, the data has been telling us that the accumulation of dysfunctional mitochondria seems to be a really, really important cellular hallmark of aging. Now, of course, that's not something that my lab has discovered. The idea that mitochondria, become less efficient, less effective with age has been around, frankly, for decades. But there were a lot of unknowns and a lot of speculation as to, how that occurs. Can we prevent it from occurring? And what What are the consequences of that? And in the last decade, I would say, we've really started to focus on a cellular pathway that recognizes and removes dysfunctional mitochondria. And that has proven quite fruitful for us. We've identified now a number of interventions that we can target that pathway. So the pathway is called the pathway of mitochondrial autophagy. And I don't know if I should back up and explain what we think autophagy is.
I think it's always good to explain that. We have covered autophagy and mitophagy quite a lot on the podcast, but I think it's always good just to repeat. I mean, I usually describe it as the way that our body gets rid of cells that are perhaps past their sell-by date, not quite working properly. It's cells eating cells to regenerate and to come out of the end of it stronger.
Yeah, so actually recycling the components within a cell. The proteins, the organelles, the lipids, and it was a pathway that was initially thought to be very important under nutrient-deprived conditions, under starvation conditions, but it turns out it seems to be very important, as you just said, for sort of maintaining general cellular health. So, I mean, one very perhaps overly simplistic way of thinking about it is as kind of like a garbage disposal or recycling unit within our cells. And yeah, so we've become, in the last 10 years, focused on developing primarily, again, genetic interventions, but we have more recently got into looking for small compounds that could activate this pathway to get rid of those damaged mitochondria that accumulate with age. So again, the idea that this damaged mitochondria are present in old organisms to a greater degree than in young organisms isn't a novel idea. It's been around for a long time, but the question of why does that happen? And so increasingly, I think we can build the argument that one of the major reasons is that this pathway, it's not that the mitochondria aren't getting damaged in a young animal. I think they are. But the machinery that removes the damaged mitochondria is functional and active when we're young. And as we age, the mitochondria continue to be damaged, but the machinery that recognizes those damaged mitochondria and targets them for degradation starts to decline in its function and activity. And that's perhaps why the dysfunctional mitochondria accumulate with age.
And this is a pathway, I'm assuming here, this is a pathway that operates in different ways according to individuals. So we're not all the same. We're not all aging in the same way. And perhaps it explains why, or maybe it doesn't explain, but it's a fact that some of us will age better and the physical decline and mental decline will be slower in some individuals than others.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think we can all see that around us. And in people, of course, it's extremely challenging to try and, figure that out. Is that due to changes, differences in diet, differences in lifestyle, socioeconomic conditions, many, many different factors at play. But as you may know, even under laboratory conditions, fruit flies and nematode worms that we try and keep under as close to identical conditions as we possibly can, meaning they all eat the same diet, they're all kept at exactly the same temperature, humidity, etc. Even there's a large degree of individual variability in certainly lifespan, and we're starting to think in the rate of aging. And that actually brings us to another major focus of the lab, which we're interested in trying to understand, as I just said, aging at a cellular level, but we're also fascinated by the pathophysiology of aging. How do age-related changes that affect organ function relate to the health and viability of the aging organism? And so, again, that individual variability in rate of aging is certainly not unique to people. It is something that occurs under tightly controlled laboratory conditions in fruit flies, for example. And again, around 10 years ago, we made an observation that I think helps us understand this a little bit better. And that relates to an important pathophysiological change that occurs with aging, and that is the loss of the function of the intestinal barrier. So that is something that we've been studying, again, in flies for around 10 years now, and we find that that's very important in terms of the health of the fly. And since we reported those findings in Drosophila, we're very intrigued to see that many other groups now are reporting that loss of intestinal barrier function is a critical pathophysiological hallmark of aging in worms, in fish, in rodents, in non-human primates, and even it would seem in people.
This is leaky intestines.
Yeah, so that's right. That was something we certainly didn't set out to study. It was one of those serendipitous discoveries where we were measuring feeding behavior in Drosophila, and one of the ways you can do that is by feeding them a dye, a non-absorbable dye, a dye that typically doesn't cross the intestinal barrier. And we found that every so often you would see a very old fly where the dye would leak out of the gut. And this provided us an approach, because it's a non-invasive assay, like they say at the end of the movies, no animals are harmed during the making of this movie. No animals are harmed during this assay. So we can actually measure other aspects of aging upon visualizing the loss of intestinal barrier function. And so now we've linked this to many systemic markers of aging, including inflammation and metabolic decay. And critically, it seems to be a harbinger or predictor of mortality. It certainly seems to be an evolutionarily conserved hallmark of aging, meaning that it's something that isn't unique to fruit flies and isn't even unique to invertebrates, but something that becomes a problem with age. And again, another sort of pathophysiological hallmark of aging, of course, that's been fairly well documented, especially in people, is overactivity of the immune response, inflammation. And as we all know, inflammation is also linked to a fairly broad range of age-onset diseases, including many neurodegenerative diseases. And again, one of the mysteries there had always been, what is driving this age-onset activation of the immune response? And again, in Drosophila at least, although others have validated this work, at least in rodents, and there's a number of studies in non-human primates as well, to say that the leaky gut and perhaps changes within the population of bacteria that live within the gut seem to be an important factor that drive age-onset inflammation. And again, that provides not just understanding of this important hallmark of aging, but perhaps gives us hope as to a potential way, again, to intervene. And if we could delay or even prevent age-onset inflammation, I think the benefits to health would be enormous.
Which is why, obviously, diet is so important in terms of the makeup of the different foods that we eat. But I just wanted to go back to talking about the variability of how we all progress in our lives and the pathways and the mechanisms involved, how we are all essentially very different in some respects. Maybe some of us are similar, but some of us are very different. And I guess that makes creating and delving into the science behind any interventions all the more complicated, because you're not just focusing it on one type of individual. We are a human race that's very, very different.
Yeah, I agree very strongly. I think as the field progresses, and the field has made a lot of progress, that will become the next major challenge, that it's entirely possible that some of the interventions that we all think about as being, the go-to, best case, pro-longevity, anti-aging intervention will indeed be helpful for certain individuals, but may not be helpful for others. And so I think you're right. I think there are many more questions about individual variability in lifespan than we have answers. But our work in flies with the intestinal barrier has started to make me think about this, at least through that lens, because one important source of that variability could come from changes within the intestine, and perhaps even changes that occur within the population of bacteria that live within the intestine. And some of that variability that we all know and recognize in individual variability may actually have its origins certainly within the intestine, and possibly within the gut bacteria within the intestine.
And you're talking about the gut microbiome here, just one of the many microbiomes that exist within our body, which we're increasingly becoming aware of as being so crucially important, really going to the heart of what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And again, this is, a dynamic area of research. This is something that, is changes in gut bacteria are being linked to many diseases and potentially even linked to therapeutic interventions. One interesting observation, and this is not an observation unique to my lab, others have reported this as well, is that if you remove the gut bacteria from a population of aging fruit flies, you actually typically reduce individual variability and longevity. What I mean by that is you sort of plateau the survival curve. And one way of interpreting that, of course, is, again, that's consistent with the idea that a lot of the individual variability comes from changes in gut bacteria. And so a number of years ago, we were able to show that this loss of intestinal barrier function is actually one important factor that seems to contribute to that is indeed changes in gut bacteria. And we could actually document and observe that some of the changes in the gut bacteria occur before the loss of intestinal barrier function, and are actually predictive, again, of loss of intestinal barrier function. So from these sorts of data, you can start to build a model of pathophysiology of aging, but also of how, therefore, individual variability could come about.
And I suppose then it begs the question, and you can extrapolate that to what are we all doing that affects the variability of our gut environment? And it comes down to essentially what we are eating. If we're not involved in any other external interventions, what do we do to change things in our gut? Well, we change our diet, we modify our diet.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I would agree and assume that a major factor that alters the composition of our gut microbiota, as you say, is what we eat. And I think this is being studied quite extensively, and there are a lot of studies on that in people. I can perhaps speak with most authority on Drosophila diets. And certainly what we see in Drosophila is high protein diets seem to be very bad news for the aging gut. So if we, and others have also reported this, grow flies, age flies, when they're eating a low protein diet, this delays the onset of this important intestinal pathology that we're studying. In other words, reduced protein intake maintains the gut barrier for longer and is also associated with a much longer and much healthier lifestyle. Again, that's in Drosophila, but there is increasingly evidence, at least from rodent studies, that low protein diets can be helpful for the aging organism and aging gut as well.
And of course, there are other aspects of longevity research. I'm thinking of the work of Walter Longo at USC in terms of low protein diets that support that theory in human beings.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I think the answers will be complicated, and there may be other ways to achieve healthy aging, but one way may be a low protein diet, and there's even recent data in both in Drosophila and also mice that just reducing certain amino acids in the diet can provide health benefits with age.
So what is, maybe just broadening this out a little bit then, what is your view of supplementation and I've talked to so many people about this, the challenges that we face in terms of how we can educate ourselves about what, if any, supplements are beneficial to us as individuals, just bearing in mind exactly what you've just said about us all being a little bit different and the variability of what's happening inside our guts. I think there's an acknowledgement that none of us eat a perfect diet these days and that there are gaps to be filled and we can fill those gaps with supplements. But how do we make those decisions?
I agree that it's a challenge. The good news is every week, and certainly every month, we have more information, meaning that there are peer-reviewed studies being published using model organisms looking at some of these questions. And we increasingly have a better understanding of, again, which cellular pathways may be important to be able to modulate to gain health benefits. So, many of the, a lot of dietary advice. Let's just take the low protein diet, for example. To my knowledge, this has not been definitively proven, but a very reasonable hypothesis to understand why would eating less protein perhaps promote longevity is that eating high levels of protein activate an important nutrient sensing pathway in our bodies called the TOR pathway, or the target of rapamycin pathway. And so I'm increasingly hopeful that we'll be able to make better informed decisions based upon a lot of this work that's going on, across many labs all throughout the world, identifying pathways that are important in the aging process. And if we can tie those pathways to perhaps supplements or nutraceuticals or small molecules that can target those pathways, then I think that would increase our confidence that might be an appropriate approach to take.
And as you say, there's new research all the time. I'm just curious, in your own life, how do you apply your knowledge, your research, your findings over the years that you've been doing this to your lifestyle? Because, we could wait 5 years, we could wait 10 years, to maybe 20 or 50 years to get some of the questions, the big questions that we have, fully answered, but we won't necessarily live that long. We've got to make decisions now and next week. So I'm just curious how you live your life according to the science that you understand right now.
Yeah, so I do try and practice what I would suggest is common sense lifestyle goals, which, staying active in the last year has become increasingly a challenge with the pandemic and the associated restrictions. But staying physically active, certainly, I'm not aware of any, if any studies, saying that being physically active is detrimental for aging. And
in fact, on the contrary, there are plenty of studies that suggest it's very beneficial to counter the effects of aging here.
Exactly. And the interesting question, of course, is, again, through which cellular pathways? And that, again, I expect to be a growth industry in the next, number of years, trying to understand that. In terms of diet, perhaps inspired by some of the studies in Drosophila saying low protein diets, I don't eat a lot of meat. I don't eat a lot of red meat. I love eating, so I'm not one of these people who can easily restrict all dietary intake or anything like that. So try and eat a diet which is mainly plant-based, and probably almost as importantly, not too much. To not eat the quantity of what we eat as well as the quality is going to matter a lot. But again, without getting too philosophical, as I say, I love to eat. So I think quality of life is very important as well as quantity of life. And there's enormous social benefits to eating together. And, that's something, sharing food with others is one of the things that make life meaningful and wonderful. And so it's not something I would ever want to give up. So, from time to time, I try and balance it out. If I, eat a lot one day, maybe not so much the next day, or go for a longer run the next day.
I'm just curious, in terms of your research with Drosophila, fruit flies and nematodes before that, is there anything that you can say about cognitive ability as we grow older? Clearly, dementia is a huge and increasing issue for our populations right now. And, it all seems to come back to the gut in some respects. That I think there are certainly links between the gut makeup and our mental abilities. Have you looked at anything like that?
Not yet in any great detail. But what I can tell you is a couple of things. So just as is the case, as you just said, in us, fruit flies become more forgetful as they get older. That's fairly well documented. And I think we're starting to understand in a more clear manner that perhaps the same cellular mechanisms that are important in these devastating diseases of the aged brain, Alzheimer's, for example, are shared mechanisms with the aging process. So I mentioned, a few moments ago, the accumulation of dysfunctional mitochondria. So that is a well-documented cellular hallmark of aging. It's also linked to the diseases of the aging brain, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. Another major cellular hallmark of aging is the accumulation of aggregated or misfolded proteins. And that also is not only a hallmark of aging, it's a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. It's a hallmark of several neurodegenerative diseases. So I remain optimistic that interventions that we and others can discover that prevent the accumulation of dysfunctional mitochondria, interventions that prevent the accumulation of aggregated or misfolded proteins, will be beneficial or will help delay the onset and progression of these neurodegenerative diseases. I think there's a lot of reasons for optimism there.
And you mentioned fruit flies become more forgetful as they get older, and it's well documented. How do you measure that?
Yeah, so you can measure memory in fruit flies by pairing something either positive or negative, something that they like or something they dislike, with a specific odor. And then if it's something they dislike, you can repeat the experiment with only the odor and see if they act like they dislike it, or vice versa. So it's somewhat Pavlovian in its, in its nature. And that it's been known for maybe almost 35, 40 years now that flies can remember, for example, a mild electric shock. And then, and if you pair that with an odor, they're going to associate that with the negative stimulus.
It's endless fascination to me that fruit flies and nematode worms can be very, very accurate models for human beings. You wouldn't think it, but they can be.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and I think it will turn out that, of course, you can't model everything in an invertebrate model. But so far, the data has been extremely positive in terms of the interventions that were initially discovered in those model organisms turn out to be potential targets in people, and especially for neuromuscular diseases. Neuromuscular aging, I think flies and worms seem to be really, really terrific models.
Just as we close, I often ask people this. As you look at your own life and the progression of your life, do you have aspirations as it applies to longevity and getting older? You've described your healthy lifestyle, but is your own longevity something that you give a lot of thought to still as a relatively young man?
Yes. Yeah, quality of life is something that's incredibly important to me. I love to read, I love to think, I love to learn, I love to experience. I love to be, one of the things I look forward to is actually, going for a bicycle ride, going for a run, being physically active. And so, yeah, the idea that these things would be taken away gradually or otherwise is not something that I take lightly, and of course I see it with my mother, is in her mid-70s, is still in good health, but again, you just don't want to see these things slipping away. I'm a big believer in this is it. This is our life, and we have to make it count. And what makes us happy in our everyday life and in the longer term is really important. And for me, being mentally active and, as importantly, physically active is incredibly, incredibly important to me.
And living in Santa Monica, California probably helps in that respect. It's a question coming from the UK, I often get asked about the atmosphere and the encouragement sometimes that you get in a state like California to look after yourself.
I do think that can play a role for sure. Certainly, the climate helps a lot. Being able to, so let's focus pre-pandemic, where we can all, go in, as we choose. But the idea that you can be physically active outdoors almost any day, throughout the year is really appealing. And yeah, perhaps being surrounded by, living somewhere where it certainly looks to be where most people seem, focused on living a healthy lifestyle can also sort of, help as well.
Yeah, and before I sound, or maybe even making you sound too smug about the fact that we're living in California and can do these things, clearly we can exercise, we can live healthy lifestyles anywhere else in the world. I think we perhaps are a little bit privileged and lucky to live in a beautiful environment like this, but clearly it doesn't preclude exercise, it doesn't preclude a healthy diet, I would argue, anywhere in the world.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think we can all make time, no matter, to do our best to, focus on our own individual, health. I always see it as a way you're not wasting time, you're buying time, future time, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to finish this. David, fascinating conversation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It was really interesting to talk to you.
And I will put into the show notes for this episode of the podcast a link to your website, your university website, if anyone wants to dig a little deeper. You'll find that at our website, llama-podcasts.com, LLAMA-podcasts.com. That's the Live Long and Master Aging podcast website. This is a HealthSpan media production. If you enjoy what we do, you can rate and review us at Apple Podcasts. You can follow us in social media at Llama Podcast, and you can direct message me at Peter Bowes. Do take care, and many thanks for listening. Health optimization is what this podcast is all about, and that means taking care of our mitochondria, the energy centres of our cells. Physical strength, avoiding frailty is key, and that's why the science behind urolithin A and the work of Timeline Nutrition is so interesting. You can find out more and get a discount code at our website and in the show notes for this episode.